we better get underway. So it's the end of a nice, hot, fairly dry day here in Tokyo today, which makes me a little bit homesick. Of course, I'm Australian. My name is Christopher Beccaria, and I grew up in the north of Australia in the state of Queensland, and I'll show you a map later on. And in the summer, we get some really hot days like today, but particularly where I grew up, well, grew up in a few places in the state, but most in southeast Queensland, around Brisbane and the Gold Coast. So we get lots of days like this that are not humid, normally about 28, 29 degrees, bit of a breeze, so it's actually fairly comfortable. If you go way out in the inland, it gets up to 40 degrees, super dry. If you go up to the north, it normally is not above about 30 degrees, but it gets really humid, although Tokyo, I find, gets sticky. Way down in South Australia and Victoria in the summer, it can, because of the heat coming from the desert, it can get up to the high 30s. But very, very dry heat. If anyone's been to Arizona, it's remarkably similar. I like a hot summer's day with big clear skies. I'm not very good with grey skies and humidity. You know, as you look out the window and it looks like you're in England, but then you open the window and it's like being hit with the steam from a sauna, which I like in Finland because you can then jump into a cold lake or something like that. Okay, well, we've got the poll evolving here. I'll share the results in a moment, but I'll summarize them. It's about 1/3 of you have actually been to Australia. I'm quite shocked to see only 4% of you have actually been to New Zealand. That's very low. Disappointing. I think New Zealand is truly one of the most beautiful places on the planet. I'm consider myself very lucky to be an Australian citizen. Australian citizens automatically have the right to reside in New Zealand. So this is always my kind of go-to plan. If suddenly I get thrown out of Japan or something, I might just go to New Zealand because it's so much of the beauties of Japan, with the greatest respect to Japan, without 120 million people in the way and lots of power lines and vending machines and pachinko parlors and whatnot. My general experience of driving around in New Zealand is you go around the corner and think, well, that's pretty. You drive around the next corner, that's even prettier. You drive around the next corner and like think, this is like insanely, ridiculously, stupidly beautiful. Why doesn't the whole world come here? And so only 4% of you, which means the remaining 96% of you still have to discover the place. I see only 1% of people have been to both Australia and New Zealand. Now, that's interesting because although they're 2.5 hours apart by aeroplane, 2 hours and 40 minutes or something, depending on where you fly from Sydney, then they're actually very cheap places to get to. So you can go back and forth quite easily. And a lot of people do that. And 23% only my dreams. That's good. But I won't ask whether it was New Zealand or Australia. So I like both anyway. And 40% have been to neither. Okay, so I've got a bit of work ahead of me, and that's good. Okay, so a little bit about myself. As I said, I'm Australian. I have been in SILS since the day it started back in 2004. I used to be a senior lecturer in the School of International Business, Marketing International Business at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane. I did my undergraduate and my master's degrees at the University of Queensland, again in Brisbane. I did my PhD at Australian National University. And actually, we have 3 SILS professors who are PhD graduates from Australian National University. Matthew Gray, Middle East specialist. Greg Dvorak Sensei, specialist in the Pacific and art and whatnot, interesting things. So all 3 of us are actually ANU graduates. But Greg actually is he's American, brought up in America, but he went to Australia to the ANU to do his PhD because he's very strong in Asia Pacific studies. Matthew actually was associate professor at Australian National University until we snatched him away a few years ago, convinced him to come to SILS. Still quite amazed he came, to be honest, but because it's a very prestigious institution and he's a very accomplished researcher. So anyway, it's good to hear that we've got connections with the ANU in a range of ways. Okay, I've got a big set of slides. I'll show them in a minute, but I'll just say a little bit more about myself. I originally did an undergraduate degree in journalism and political science at the University of Queensland. I then did a master's degree focusing more on Asian economics and policy at the University of Queensland, and then I did a doctorate at the ANU, which is really about international business meets politics on foreign investment regulation. Then after that, I was teaching marketing international business, and I'm teaching business here. Some of you know I teach the Introduction to Business course. I teach communication design. A lot of my research these days is about universities, university marketization, the future of the university campus, and I do a lot of stuff on creative industries. Because the one thing in my CV that I just didn't mention is that I also worked as a photographer, and I paid my way all through my university studies working as a photographer. So I've got this other interest in arts and architecture and whatnot alongside business. So aside from being able to talk to you about Australia and New Zealand as study abroad destinations, those of you particularly interested in either creative industries in any way, or business and wondering about study abroad destinations, I'm happy to give some advice independently of Australia and New Zealand. I've got a lot of research connections, particularly with a number of European institutions, such as in Denmark and Italy and whatnot. And obviously keep a close eye on what's happening in North American scene and whatnot too. So happy to advise in those disciplinary areas, as well as in relation to Australia and New Zealand. So I'll give this presentation in English, but afterwards, if you've got any Q&A, I'm very happy to do that and to have an interactive discussion, and if anyone wants to jump in, and to do that in Japanese. 一応とりあえず、英語でちょっとプレゼンテーションさせてもらうんですけど、まあ、させてもらうっていうか、バージョンだから勝手に一方的にやるんですけど、後で質問あれば、ぜひ日本語でも聞いてください。なるべく日本語でも答えしてみましょう。Okay, so I'll go over to the presentation. Okay. The poll, let me see the poll. I'll leave that open because I still see that 12 people haven't done it. So please answer the poll. Okay. Let me see. Okay, so the Waseda campus, which is a bit probably kuyashi for you at the moment, but you can get to this bit of it actually. It's outside the fence. Yeah, I guess you probably don't really want to see the campus, seeing that you have to do this virtually. So anyway, maybe in keeping with the weather today, let's dive into some details here. One thing for me growing up in Queensland, I always lived no more than 30 minutes from the coast. And there's one thing I miss in Tokyo, it's the opportunity to pop down and jump into a beautiful sea for a quick swim. All of the Australian study abroad destinations, with the exception of Canberra, are very, very close to some very nice beaches. Canberra has a lake. Not many people swim in it. It is possible, actually. It's a bit colder there, but at least you get a water view. So first of all, common images of Australia and New Zealand. Very distinctive thing, of course, with New Zealand is the Maori culture. Maori population, they are Polynesian. They settled in New Zealand something like 900 years ago. Quite a remarkable tale of settlement, actually, with the movement of Polynesian peoples from the north of the sort of Central Pacific, from Hawaii in particular, moving south and all the way down to New Zealand. Now, Australia routinely gets beaten by the New Zealanders in the rugby, and that's the next image. One observation Australians like to make, of course, is that New Zealand has a huge head start because they were settled by people who had to row canoes over thousands of kilometres of open ocean to actually settle in New Zealand in the first place. So if you ran an immigration policy based on the ability to row a dugout canoe across open ocean and then settle, is it no wonder that you end up with a bunch of really strong, tough blokes who make for a very impressive rugby team? So, of course, the All Blacks, I will openly say I am a much bigger fan of the All Blacks than I am of the Australian rugby union team, the Wallabies. And partly because the All Blacks are better, partly because they've got better uniforms. Australia has the green and gold, but to be honest, I don't like the Australian green and gold. The old Australian green and gold was a very tasteful wattle yellow and a very nice gum eucalyptus green. But along the way, in about the early or the mid 1980s, they made a very tacky green and gold, and I just find it kind of offensive. I think the New Zealanders with the All Blacks, it's a much better look. But there's actually another reason too why I sort of prefer the All Blacks. Rugby in New Zealand is the national sport, and it's played in rugby unions, played in all schools. In Australia, rugby union is only played in a few posh boys' schools, and typically kind of whiter than white schools, to be honest. And I went to a very ordinary state high school, and we played rugby league. And I was in the school rugby league team and whatnot. So there's actually the rugby league versus the rugby union. So my background, it's more a little bit kind of league oriented. Union is probably a more interesting game to play. League is easier to watch because union's really kind of complicated, all the rules and all the rest of it. There are lots of identity issues kind of happening here. And one reason why Australia is relatively weak, even though it's got a much larger population than New Zealand, is actually the pool of players of rugby union in Australia is relatively small compared to New Zealand. And then, of course, you've got all those amazing Pacific Island countries with small populations, but of a huge physical advantage. And it's also the national sport in places like Fiji too. Anyway, major part of my research is actually about place branding. Now I go to the International Place Branding Association conference and do some work on branding Japan and the world and whatnot. New Zealand provides an interesting case, not just because it's easy to sell, but also because it has one of the most remarkably successful nation branding campaigns of any country. And it's a benchmark for many other places. By comparison, Australia has one of the remarkably worst track records of branding itself internationally. I think Australia is a pretty good place, but it's incredibly bad at branding itself. On the other hand, it's 100% pure New Zealand is a textbook example of a campaign that's worked really well and is now 20 years old. Kind of helped that this, if you look down the bottom, the North and South Island of New Zealand kind of looks like the percentage mark. So 100% pure New Zealand, but also New Zealand just has such incredibly beautiful natural environment that its branding in terms of purity is good. But another thing too, and I teach branding, so I'm keen to get this message across, that if you can, as a brand, own purity, it also has the added convenience that you can add almost any image in you want. And if you Google 100% pure New Zealand, you will see universities, you will see high-tech images, you will see natural landscapes, you'll see extreme sports and whatnot. And so New Zealand is this brand and this story that leverages its natural advantages and its rich Maori culture and its success of reconciliation between white settlers and Maori communities, and at the same time is very much in the First League of Nations in terms of being innovative, creating new businesses, very strong universities, for example. So it's simultaneously a great environment, but also a knowledge-intensive economy. So, of course, the New Zealanders also like to play up their quirkiness. They've got a great sense of humour. I like this as a catch copy. Come now, if not sooner. Unfortunately, and I'm going to finish up our presentation by talking quite explicitly about the problems of COVID-19, the pandemic, and the fact that we can't just easily travel to either of these countries. Okay, the images of Australia from a Japanese perspective. Japan and Australia, long-term soccer rivals, of course. Any of you who like soccer will know some of these guys. That really tall, skinny dude with the long hair actually has played in Japan. And Kyle is always has been a problem for Japan. Okay, if we think of Sydney and iconic images of Sydney, it's the Opera House. And a great tale of the Opera House is actually there was a Danish architect who gave us our national symbol, and that's so much about Australia, of course, is to do with our migration legacy and whatnot. And of course, the Sydney Harbour Bridge is another symbol. By the way, it's referred to in Australia as the coat hanger because it does look like a coat hanger. Of course, the climate is very friendly in large parts of Australia. About 2 years ago, I was starting to think longer term where would I might like to retire to. I've still got a long time to retire, but I thought longer term I should think about this. So I started doing research on how many hours of sunshine a year do various places have, how much rain and average temperatures. And so I was looking at some rankings based on total sunshine a year. No surprise, of course, Arizona and the desert in Mexico comes up right at the top with sunshine. But then to my surprise, I discovered that actually my home city of Brisbane and Sydney, where I used to live, is right up there actually. So it's funny, I went all around the world only to discover that some of the best weather in the world is back where I come from. So even in midwinter in particularly Brisbane and Sydney is quite mild. Melbourne gets colder. I'll come back to that. So some more images. Of course, we tend to think of huge expanses of the inland desert, some symbols such as Uluru looking across the desert, what used to be called Ayers Rock, the bush in Australia, the Gold Coast, which is very close to where my parents live. And of course, we also tend to think of Australia's unique animals, wallabies. This actually was taken driving out in the countryside near where my great-grandfather grew up as a boy. If you're wondering about my surname, by the way, it's of Germanic background, borderlands, Germany, Poland, and my great-grandfather's family were German speakers who settled in Australia. My grandfather was called Otto, but he was born in 1914, so he wasn't allowed to speak German because that was the outbreak of World War I. Anyway, there is a wallaby, and this was actually in my parents' garden. So yes, the iconic wildlife does get very, very close. Mind you, they were living on a mountain. They're moving back to the city now because they're getting old and health issues and whatnot. Anyway, for some older folks, you may have an image of Mad Max, the original Mad Max set in Australia. This guy is older than me now, so he's a real oyaji, but a young Mel Gibson. Maybe the putting the wallaby and the shotgun together is probably kind of problematic. Looks like he's out there to shoot them. Okay. We often have these images of Australia as great desert landscapes and kind of rough characters, but actually Australia's population is overwhelmingly urban. Indeed, a much larger proportion of Australia's population live in cities than is the case in the United States. It's 6 state capitals tend to dominate. New Zealand, again, we have very strong images of its rural bliss, but cities like Auckland and Wellington and a smaller but very beautiful city, Christchurch and Dunedin and whatnot, have a large proportion of the population. So these are big cities, but they also tend to be green cities. And also very strikingly, both Australia and New Zealand have had incredibly strong economies. I'll say something more about this later on. But Australia, until the COVID pandemic this year, had unbroken 30-year track record of economic growth, no recession in 30 years. Indeed, it holds the record in human history for an unbroken track record of economic growth. It overtook the Netherlands, Holland about 2 years ago. The previous record was 27 years. So the cities everywhere, infrastructure are quite advanced because these have been very prosperous societies. Also, because of the weather, people tend to value outdoor lifestyle. And as soon as we have nice weather like we do today, I'm always looking to find a spot outside, even though skin-wise, I'm a mixture of Scandinavians, Scots, Germans. So genetically, I'm not actually very much suited to being out in the sun. Anyway, let's turn our focus to universities, because this is primarily what you're interested in. Of course, until the whole COVID-19 thing, of course, you're on track absolutely to go on a study abroad program. You've got some uncertainties, but you've still got enough, particularly if you're a first year student, enough time in your program to explore study abroad. In summary, key things from the top: very vibrant social life. All of these universities that are partners of Waseda are located in big cities. So there's actually not the advantages and the disadvantages of being in a little tiny college town like you would get with a small liberal arts college in, say, in the Midwest. And I've been to a number of them in the US, and they're interesting environments too. Different from the US, but like much of Europe, you can drink from when you're 18. So if you really need a drink, you're better off going to a place where you can legally do it. US and US institutions are quite strict on this if you're under 21. Good lifestyle, city life, but near the beach. Only a 1 to 3 hour time difference. Australia is, for the most part, a 1 hour time difference. If you go to Perth, it's a couple of hours more. If you go to New Zealand, it's a couple of hours the other way. Strikingly, they're migrant societies. More than a quarter of the Australian population is foreign-born, and more than 20% in the New Zealand case. Also, both countries have a very high level of interest in Japan, but not so many Japanese students. Japanese is often studied as a foreign language. Indeed, in Australia, it's the most popular foreign language, which means that you can find plenty of students with an interest in Japan, local students, and are keen to interact with you. This is significant because, well, until COVID-19, we have very large international student communities, which means that you will fit in easily, but you won't stand out. That is a very significant point. A couple of important things on the timing of programs. The academic calendar in Australia and New Zealand, mirroring the fact that it is the southern hemisphere and the seasons are reversed, just going into winter now. My mum was telling me that they needed firewood for the fireplace when I was speaking to her yesterday. So the seasons are reversed, so the academic calendar is different. Everywhere, generally, historically, because of the heat and, you know, pleasures of summer, the summer holiday is long. So what does this mean? So typically the exchange programs from Waseda, Kokan Yugaku, follow the traditional academic year, which runs from late February to November, okay? So it's the spring and the fall. So haru shupatsu, okay? Which means haru boshu for daitai kokan no bai. Daitai, でも10代の例もあるんですね. Okay, because we do have a fall and spring option. Griffith University and you have an option, either Brisbane or the Gold Coast campus. I actually recommend the Gold Coast campus because you can live right at Surfers Paradise. You can take a brand new streetcar straight to the university campus, and you can go for a swim every morning, go for a surf, and then go to college. Very, very attractive. Macquarie University, which is also close to the beach, that's in Sydney, and several other partners offer now a spring departure. No, I'm sorry, I'm complicated. Exchange, but from the fall departures. So we'll talk further about these. So significantly, the fee-based programs, where typically you've got a combination of English plus 1 semester in the faculty, they tend to run from September to June. So in short, what they do is they mirror the time frame for those study abroad programs in North America and Europe. 後期出発、結局。7月出発で、9月出発で、and then you're back in June. Now, one of the implications of this is because of the summer break, there actually is a break in the middle if you were in Australia and New Zealand and those at that time. Now, it's very likely these programs will be offered as usual because, recruitment will be in the fall because your departure would not be until the fall of the next year. Now, importantly, though, for SILS students, especially if your English is very good, most of these programs are English-based for the first semester. So, 日本語で言うと大体秋出発は最初に集中的に英語。そしてもう一つ one semester は学部で勉強する。だからすぐに英語でかなりできる人はちょっと物足りないという印象あるかもしれません。So you may feel something's a little bit lacking if your English is already very good, if your TOEFL, your IELTS score is already very high and you're very comfortable studying specialist courses already here in SILS in English, then these fee-based programs for departure may not be for you. You'd be better off going for an exchange program. Okay. Now, the challenge has been historically for Australian institutions to offer exchange from the fall is the different academic calendar timing. Now, the fall semester in Australia actually will start typically in later July, which means that it's just around the finishing of our spring semester. And which means that if you were to go on exchange, technically from the fall, you actually have to leave here before even our summer holidays. So you have to get off straight away. Now, we do have several institutions that have been flexible on this. Now, in a strange way, what's happening actually because of COVID-19 is some Australian institutions are delaying the start of their second semester. But of course, that's not on offer for people here. Very significant thing in Australia and New Zealand is work rights. So exchange students, for example, all international students, they have work rights part-time during the semester and full-time during the break. So actually, even a language-based program where you had this blank over the summer gave you the opportunity to do work or an internship or something there. The important thing to keep in mind, though, is that COVID-19 has complicated things. That those work rights continue, but it used to be very easy to get part-time work. But of course, with shutdowns, lockdowns, lots of people lost their jobs in retail, in hospitality, so cafes and restaurants and whatnot. So I don't think it will be as easy to get work as in the past. So we have to be realistic about that. Okay, so let's just draw a couple of comparisons with the Australian New Zealand system. And Japan. What's really striking is if we look at this data, this is the Koto Kyoiku Sanka Ritsu kana, Nihongo de yuto, participation in higher education. Now, there's actually very considerable variation across countries, and I've put some of this data here because I thought, particularly for those of you who may not be thinking about Australia or New Zealand, you still want some takeaways about relativities for other places. And what is very significant is how much it's varied and how much it's actually changed over time. Societies in general have tried to encourage people to participate in higher education. There's lots of funding challenges and many things. Policy countries have dealt with this in various ways. So statistically, we see that it's very high in places like Canada, Japan, Israel, the US, Korea, Australia, the UK, New Zealand. And interestingly, actually, in some of those countries that are very famous for university being free, and where we often look enviously and say, oh, you know, in Germany or even in places like Denmark or whatnot, or France, universities are free. You know, Japan should be like that. So, what a lot of people forget about is that there are far fewer university places. The complicated thing in the French case is everyone has a right to go if they've got a certain level, and even the university pays it, but still participation rates are relatively low. So we have to look at the scale of the system. What is quite striking is, talking about Australia and New Zealand, they are very much comparable to Japan in terms of participation rates. This is looking at tertiary education in general, and in recent years, Australia and New Zealand have jumped even further. Now, another question is, how much do societies actually spend on their university system? And this is a big debate in Japan now, because relatively the amount that the government spends in Japan is quite low. And as you know, your parents are paying a lot of money to Waseda for your SILS education, make up the difference. And so we can look at the data at total expenditure and we can find this. By the way, some of you know, those of you taking my Introduction to Business class, I have also given lots of money to Waseda. My daughter was a SILS student. She's now graduated. Some of you also know she took 5 years to graduate. So I have given a lot of money to Waseda. So please study, okay? I know the costs. You may be wondering, where did my daughter go and study abroad? Well, my daughter, of course, had also Australian citizenship, so it was an option to go back to Australia. But she chose to do something completely different, and she actually went to Copenhagen. She went to Copenhagen Business School on exchange, but the cost of living in Copenhagen was very high. So I have worked out the total amount of money I've spent on my daughter of 5 years plus Copenhagen, and yeah, that's all I'll say. Okay, a little bit about research. From a student's perspective, you tend to be, just thinking about classes, and we think of universities as primarily as a place you go to study. But of course, the very nature of the university has always been, traditionally, that it connects research with teaching. The truth is that they put teaching originally together with research because the professors really wanted to do research, but people didn't really want to pay for it. So the business model was simple. They said, well, we'll get you to teach, and in return, you've got a guaranteed job, and we'll provide you the research facilities. And then they found out that the new knowledge creation helped the teaching as well. So to be a university, and it's actually very clear in the law in places like Australia and New Zealand and the UK, to be a university, by definition, you must also be involved in research. And all of Waseda's Australian partners and key New Zealand partners are top research institutions as well. By the way, the GO8 means group of 8. This is the oldest universities, in some respects the most prestigious, certainly the most research intensive, and all of them do very, very well in terms of global university rankings. Also, a very significant thing is that if you're on a major university campus, such as the University of Queensland, or Australian National University, or Melbourne University, or Sydney University, actually more than half of all the staff who are academic staff actually don't teach. They're actually pure researchers. So huge research laboratories. The University of Queensland, for example, is leading one of the major efforts now to develop a vaccine for COVID-19. And they have perhaps the world's most interesting approach for developing a vaccine, very different from the other ways that it's done. So there's very vibrant intellectual life on campus. There's always seminars and workshops and whatnot if in a field that you're interested in. So there's a very strong connection between the research and specialization of knowledge. Now, a little bit about the New Zealand case. I've spoken mostly about Australia. New Zealand, from its early days of settlement, they were very focused on creating educational institutions. And in fact, the University of Otago, which is the oldest there, 1871, is actually older than the University of Chicago, quite strikingly. And it was established it's down in Dunedin, down in the bottom, down the south. We tend to focus on Auckland more. A very significant thing with New Zealand, in the early days of settlement of New Zealand, the South Island was more important than the North Island. Two reasons. Gold was found around here, and so there was a huge gold boom, and it brought enormous wealth. But also the sailing ships, if you look at the map that used to come from Europe, they used to go down around South Africa, right across the bottom of the Indian Ocean, across the bottom of Australia. If they were unfortunate, they ran into Australia by accident, got shipwrecked, right across the bottom of Australia, and then they approached New Zealand from the bottom. They went up. It's only with the development of aeroplanes, jet aircraft, that the first place of arrival became Auckland. So Dunedin used to be the cultural hub of New Zealand, and it's a very beautiful, relatively small city, but a notable university. Then that university became the University of New Zealand with 3 colleges, branch campuses: Auckland, Canterbury College, Christchurch, and Victoria University College in Wellington. Now, when New Zealand became independent, they made Wellington the capital because it was central between the North Island and the South Island. Now, all of these became independent universities, and all of them are significant Waseda partners. And particularly Victoria University in Wellington is a SILS partner. That's a SILS level partner, Kashokan Kyote. So Australia, I won't go through all the details of them, but these are your states: Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria. The national capital is Canberra. Again, like New Zealand, this was a compromise because the major politicians of the day were from Sydney and they were from Melbourne. And so when they unified Australia, they decided to build a capital halfway in between, and they picked a place which literally was a sheep station, and they built the capital there. And so it's kind of inland. All of the other cities, they're all beautiful cities. Perth, University of Western Australia, very prestigious and beautiful campus. Adelaide as well. Melbourne, we have several key partners there. We have Monash and Melbourne University, both very good universities. Sydney, we have several key partners. Up in Brisbane, we have Griffith University, and the Gold Coast is 1 hour south of Brisbane, and Griffith is a large campus there. In fact, it's outgrown the Brisbane campus because the Gold Coast is a huge population growth area, and the University of Queensland. So a little bit, just very, very briefly, each state was independent. It was in 1901 that they were put together in the Australian case to unify the nation. So these original universities, they're often referred to as the sandstone universities. Following Oxford and Cambridge, they were built typically with stone, and mostly sandstone in Australia, which is beautiful golden hue actually. And they're very much modeled on the Oxford-Cambridge model. And an important point is, and we see this throughout the former British Empire, then British Commonwealth. So Oxford and Cambridge were the models initially of elite shoninzu kyoiku, like serious shoninzu kyoiku. Very limited, almost one-on-one tutorials, very small-scale tutorials. But then in the UK, a model developed. First of all, the University of Glasgow, they had a big industrial boom, and then newer universities such as the University of London, part of it, and Birmingham and Manchester and whatnot, major industrial centres where rising middle classes wanted to go to university. They created a larger scale lecture model, but they also kept the Oxford-Cambridge model of the smaller tutorials. So it's a hybrid model that was very much a pioneering thing that was developed in the UK and was copied then in bigger institutions in the US and in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Quite common. I saw Sidoli Sensei has mentioned this as well in the Canadian case. In continental Europe, they tended to have the lectures rather than tutorials. And as demand for higher education expanded, they tended to increase the scale of the lecture, but didn't have the Oxford-Cambridge model. And each system works a little bit differently in each continental country, so rather different models. But this is a very distinctive model, the lecture plus the tutorial. I think in my own classes in SILS, with say we've got about 200 in the Introduction to Business, we could benefit from a similar kind of model. Okay, so The old universities tend to look very much medieval. They were inspired by Oxford and Cambridge. By the way, if you get to go to the University of Chicago, it looks kind of remarkably like this, and it was built in the late 19th century to look medieval, because this was evoked, you know, what the notion of the grand medieval university was. Australian National University, one of Australia's most prestigious universities, very strong in terms of studies of the Asia and Pacific and sciences and medicine and whatnot, was created after World War II. And it was very deliberately a national project. It's the only university that was created under federal law rather than state law. It's directly funded by the national government and a real center of research. And the architecture is very mid-century. It was very optimistic, very modernist, post-war. And I've experienced both the Sandstone University of the University of Queensland and also this very mid-century dynamic of Australian National University, as we see here, University House. But also because it's such a research-centered and so much money has been coming into university systems, kind of world-class research facilities. So this is the John Curtin School of Medical Research. And this is the chemistry building and whatnot at the Australian National University. So this is a really important point in terms of thinking about university education in different countries. This is a really important point, a really important point. Hint, hint, hint. You have a quiz afterwards, right? Really important point. Okay. Universities tend to offer very specialized education in the Australian case and in the New Zealand case. When you're finishing up high school, you're really at 17, you think, what do I want to be? And then you pick a field that really is quite specialized. And as a consequence, if you are looking to strengthen your specialization, maybe that you're interested in, you know, SILS is very broad. You can do lots of things and it has many advantages. But if you want to deepen your knowledge in a field, Australian and New Zealand universities offer that. Not the only ones, of course. They're highly specialized institutions in Scandinavia. Some US colleges do this as well, more the state universities rather than the liberal arts universities. Colleges, and of course many British universities are quite specialized. One of the implications is an interesting thing that kind of, unlike Japan, how much money you make in a career over a lifetime of earnings actually has much more to do with what you study, your field of study, rather than where you studied, which means that yes, all of the Waseda partners are very prestigious universities and very high in the rankings. But at the end of the day, the biggest determinant of what people want to study in, say, Australia and New Zealand is the field they want to go into and if they anticipate earnings. So people will often choose to go to, for example, where I used to teach, Queensland University of Technology, they would choose to go there rather than the University of Queensland to study what they want. You know, arguably in Japan, unless you're doing something really specialized, you go to the university that has the highest hensaichi you can get in as a proxy measure of status. Now, very significantly, this is data on Australia but New Zealand too, dramatic increases in both the number of domestic and international students over the last couple of decades. And I just want to highlight this significant rise in international students. And there's also been a very significant change too. These days, very important point, comparing with systems, very important point. Okay, girl power. Women now significantly outnumber men in university enrollments in Australia. This is only to 2013. I couldn't find a neat or up-to-date figure. I found the figures, but not so neat. And interesting effects of this, certain professions are becoming very much female-dominated. Medicine, law, journalism. So many fields now, women are outperforming men, and as a consequence, also average earnings for women are overtaking men in many areas. Very good example of this, former Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, very impressive individual. She has been quite an advocate for higher education exchange and also very much deepened the partnership between Australia and Japan. By the way, unquestionably, excepting the United States, I would say Japan's most reliable partner in the Asia Pacific is Australia, and Australia feels exactly the same about Japan. A little bit about UQ, not UQ Mobile. I use UQ Mobile, but partly because I like the brand. I'm a UQ graduate. This is from Brisbane, okay? It's the aerial shot of the University of Queensland, huge kind of beautiful campus and connected to the CBD by public transport. Lots of on-campus accommodation, colleges, lots of other options. It did start right in the middle of the city though. And actually where it first started is now part of the Queensland University Technology campus. Then it had a beautiful 1930s campus built in sandstone, but in a more, as I say, Byzantine Art Deco style, not a medieval style. But actually before the students could move there, World War II broke out. And you may know that Japan invaded the Philippines, kicked the Americans out. Douglas MacArthur relocated, many people don't know this, his South Pacific Command to Brisbane in Australia, looked around and said, I need brand new offices. And they said, oh, that beautiful University of Queensland campus you haven't opened yet, I'll take that over. So he took that over. Now, most of my Japanese I studied by myself. I took just one class as a graduate student when I was in the University of Queensland. And it's fascinating. I noticed my introduction to Japanese class on there was a little note on the wall which said that Douglas MacArthur used to have his office in the room where I was learning Japanese. And I thought that was a very nice symbolic art that really symbolized how University of Queensland and Australia kind of put that war history behind it and actually turned it around and became leading center for Japanese studies and Japanese English translation and whatnot. It's a pioneer in those programs actually, and students going also on the fee-based program to UQ can study Japanese translation. Beautiful campus, as I mentioned. That's me when I was 19. I was one of the student union leaders with a really bad Duran Duran haircut, so we'll get past that. Very important thing, if you are studying in Australia, and when the jacarandas bloom, it's very tempting to have lots of a hanami, but the rule is you better be studying before the jacarandas bloom because otherwise you're going to run out of time, okay? You're not going to be able to study to do well on your exams. These are not native trees to Australia. They're actually from Latin America, but lots of ships crossed over from Latin America to Australia, and they're very widespread in Australia, and Australians think of them as a symbol of, say, particularly Sydney and Brisbane, although Tel Aviv and Israel is full of them as well. Okay, now to wrap up, and then we'll go to our Q&A. Let's do a bit of a reality check with COVID-19. I'm sorry. Okay, great news. New Zealand last week declared completely COVID-free, no cases. All restrictions have been dropped. You can see videos of Prime Minister hugging people in cafes. Very nice. Australia is getting close. There's still got a few cases in a couple of places. Some states have had none for quite a while. But there are still restrictions on movement between states. Literally, you can't freely cross between Queensland and New South Wales, and there's political issues. And Australia and New Zealand, the borders are currently closed. If I go back to Australia, I have to spend 2 weeks in quarantine. But I won't do that anyway because under current rules in Japan, despite being a long-term resident, I can't get back in the country. Although they did announce on Friday very surreptitiously some exceptions. So Japan has completely closed its borders to even long-term residents with family. And it's a very important point. Japan, Australia, New Zealand, other countries that are doing well in suppressing COVID-19 are actually more hesitant to open their borders. You can now go to Italy, okay? Because they're less afraid that someone will spoil their success in getting rid of COVID-19 because they've still got COVID-19. So this is a very important point to keep in mind. Keep that in mind for the quiz too. Just because countries have been incredibly successful in getting the pandemic under control doesn't mean that the borders will open more quickly than other places, okay? But just, I've got some statistics here and you can look through them yourself, but effectively what happened was a very quick, speedy response, partly a border closure and whatnot, which brought the cases down to almost zero, an Australian case, and I've got them state by state. And why are these border controls an issue? Because, and this here, this is the Queensland case, these are the number of COVID cases, COVID-19 cases associated with people coming from overseas. And you can see they're overwhelmingly overseas related. And local transmission is almost completely people who got it from a family member who came back from overseas. So there is hesitancy to open the borders. However, the government just the other day, Sunday, has flagged a pilot scheme for students to be able to return. But you'd have to do some maybe quarantine arrangements, and the universities are preparing colleges and whatnot to help this. So this is a promise. It's called a secure corridor proposal. But in the short term, there's over 100,000 students with a valid student visa who are stuck outside of Australia. And the first policy is to return them. By the way, unlike Japan, Australia still keeps those visas valid, as does New Zealand. Japan actually told people with a valid visa they've got to reapply, which is kind of messy. The universities have become very dependent on international student revenues, and they face a severe financial crisis, which also means that they're very keen to get university students back from overseas. So they're looking to be creative. The broader point, the economy has not had a downturn, and this is the first downturn. So in a way, that means fixing the university system becomes even more important. I'm conscious of our time, so I'll just simply note that after World War II, Australia and New Zealand welcomed lots of international students at the government's expense as development aid. From the late 1980s, particularly because there are Southeast Asian countries were becoming quite affluent, and particularly out of Singapore and Malaysia, Hong Kong, more affluent students were coming to study in Australia. The government, to be blunt, said, we're paying for this, you guys can pay. They switched from aid to trade and encouraged the universities to recruit international students. And Australian universities and later New Zealand universities became very active on this. And they, in terms of proportion of international students, some of the highest rates in the world. Now, some people criticize the system saying this is all about making money. Well, yes, but also those monies, because they're not-for-profit institutions, have been put into rebuilding the campuses. And Australian and New Zealand university campuses are really stunning in terms of the new infrastructure they have, world-class learning centers and whatnot. And you go into public universities in a lot of other countries that don't have this orientation, and it's quite confronting, the poor condition of a lot of universities. The UK and other places have copied this. Denmark, for example, has moved towards fee-based programs for international students, and Germany and a number of other countries are considering it, although they're keeping the fees lower than the Anglo world does. So the summary point is that there are lots of international students, fee-paying international students, at least until COVID-19. So a visiting student doesn't stand out, but there's very good support because the institutions have really developed that capability. I've got just a little bit on revenues. You can see here that even 2014, in fact, for the most prestigious universities, it's significantly higher. Even a third of their revenues come from international students. And so it is a major education export sector. Japan has potential on this, but I don't think they've ever really kind of thought about it like that, okay? The UK has certainly copied it. And you can see here student fees as a proportion of income. New Zealand has attracted fewer full fee-paying students, and as a consequence, the government spends more on research, for example. More of the research comes. Australia's challenge, of course, is that if international student revenues stay lower, the government has to put much more money into the universities to fund the research and domestic student places and whatnot. Takeaway lesson, everybody wants international students. So, unfortunately though, nobody knows what's going to happen in terms of study abroad programs. Currently, Waseda is recruiting, the CIE is recruiting for programs for spring of next year. So that would be departing February. And everybody is hoping that border controls and whatnot will be fixed so that this will be possible to have international students back from the spring, including exchange students. But there is some uncertainty about that. There's a lot more optimism that the issues will be sorted out, either a secure corridor or a vaccination or both for the fall of next year. So if you're a first year student thinking about the fall, I don't see any problems. Spring of next year, I'm hopeful, but no guarantees. If you're a first year student and you chose to defer your study abroad, which you can do in SILS and curriculum, it's absolutely fine to do that. If you were to simply say, I'm going to apply to go to Australia, New Zealand in the spring of 2022, I'm very optimistic that Australia and New Zealand will have the arrangements in place to make that a very, very good plan for you. And it's also on exchange basis. And that would be a very good move for you to do. And the final thing I'll say is that a lot of people worry about shukatsu in relation to that, but you need not, because if you depart in the February of your third year, だから3年の2月の終わりぐらいとかに出発すると、同じ3年生の11月終わりぐらいに帰ってこれる。だから十分就活する時間もあるんです。逆に後期の勉強はないので、ある意味でちょっと優先的になるかもしれない。Now, you won't be abroad the full year, but then again, we see this with the UK anyway, that actually study abroad is not a full year. It often is more like just 9 months, unless you choose to stay on. So deferring study abroad until spring of your third year is potentially a very attractive option to go to Australia and New Zealand. So any of you really, really worried about COVID and the nobody knows reality, at very least, you should think of Australia and New Zealand as a kind of subedidome. And the one thing I can say is Australia and New Zealand institutions will have a huge backlog of people wanting to come to Japan. So Waseda can actually get out there and negotiate exchange places. And indeed, I used to have an advisor's role in the Ryugak Center. I know, if anything, our problem has been imbalance on exchange. More Australian and New Zealand students wanted to come to Waseda than the other way around. So I'm quite confident that there will be quite a few exchange places outbound for Waseda students to go to top Australian and New Zealand institutions. So about the actual study abroad programs and COVID, nobody knows, but very happy to have questions about Australia and New Zealand. Okay, and I'll end it there and over to yourselves. So fire away.